had to apologize to you because Ashley, one of your PAs, reached out to me about a month ago and said that she's got a great guest, someone that would be a really good fit for the platform. And for some reason, it went straight into my spam account. And I never checked my spam account. And a couple of weeks ago, I was scrolling through and I stumbled upon this email. And I thought, man, actually, this sounds really interesting. I hope this offer is still available. Then I saw the date on it. And I was like, oh, it's going to be a bold move, me reaching back out now. So I was grateful that you're good enough to withstand the fact that I didn't quite get your email in time and come and jump back on, man. It's a conversation I'm looking forward to having with you.
Yeah, likewise. No, it's my pleasure being on, and I'm glad we were able to link up and make it happen. So I'm excited.
I was having a bit of a read through some of your stuff, and the reason I was curious to get you on here is because I've spoken to a few people around the subject of nutrition, and obviously this podcast, the majority of the audience, from what I can tell, is distance runners, relatively a lot of newer distance runners, people who have been in the scene for a couple of years, and they're trying to navigate training and they're trying to navigate recovery. And one of the big things that they're trying to navigate is nutrition and how to develop some kind of a plan that works well for them. And it's an interesting conversation. And I know, as a guy who's been in the scene for a long time, it's an overwhelming conversation because there's so many different opinions on the topic. You can listen to one podcast and it says, hey, no, make sure it's just all meat. And then the next podcast says, no, hey, you know what, the donut diet's fine because you're going to be burning it off. So, I thought as a way of introduction, it might be nice just to hear a little bit about your background and what it is you actually teach around the subject of fitness, nutrition, and developing a diet that works well for you.
Yeah, so I think you hit the nail on the head with just talking about a diet that works for you, and by that I mean what works for one person is not necessarily going to work for another. And I think that kind of gets to your point of it's confusing. Like you hear conflicting protocols, you hear conflicting guidance on even sports specific guidance, right? You hear conflicting stuff. So I'm kind of a nutrition agnostic in some sense. And by that, I mean, I don't have, a specific way of eating that I'm trying to teach clients. But I do have principles that will apply. And through the application of those principles, which is done in kind of a behavior change, habit-based model, by the application of those, we're going to figure out what's the best thing for you, right? Like, and so we're looking at body composition, but we're also looking at performance. We're looking at sleep. We're looking at energy. Some objective factors, some subjective factors, and then we want to, essentially get as many data points as we can over the course of a coaching program to determine what are the trends, and then we can figure out the best approach. But when we talk about principles, we're looking at essentially whole minimally processed foods is kind of our starting point. And I think for a lot of people, there's so many different places that you can go just with that starting point in terms of cleaning up your diet. And it's obviously going to be maybe a little bit different for people that are actively competing at a really high level. But for, most general population clients, like the clients that I work with, when you just start attacking whole minimally processed foods and you look at how much processed foods, but things in a package, right, that you're getting, you're not preparing or doing anything. When we just start taking a look at that and figuring out how we can increase the nutritional quality of the foods that you're eating and the nutritional density, right? So like if you take something out of a package, what nutrition, quality nutrition are you really going to get from that? Of course, it has protein, carbs, and fat, right? But versus, trying to eat some raw vegetables, or trying to cook even one meal at home a day, or something like that, or maybe bringing your lunch to work. Um, but that whole minimally processed foods is kind of the overarching principle. And then when we break that down in terms of macronutrients, um, kind of seeing, okay, how can we, we'll start by getting an idea of what you're consuming, and whether that's a food log for a few days, whether somebody's previously been tracking their food, but we need some kind of baseline so I can have an idea for what you're consuming. And then we take it a step further and say, okay, when we're looking at protein and carbohydrates and and fat, how can we increase quality sources of those macronutrients that not only are going to make you feel better or help you in the pursuit of your specific goals, but also that are sustainable. And that's the big, that's kind of the big second principle, you could say. And I think that's a really important piece to kind of take and run with, because there, like you mentioned at the beginning of beginning of the show, like there are no shortage of protocols and options out there, right? The information is out there, and most of it is going to work in some form or fashion, realistically. The question is it going to work for the long haul? And can you sustain whatever you're doing for the long haul? Or is it too complicated? Or is it like you're white knuckling it, you're just trying to like willpower your way through it? And so kind of in terms of nutrition coaching as a whole, that's why, my programs themselves are a lot longer in nature, because we're going through this habit formation, process. And that takes time, right? Because we have to assess, we have to figure out where we are to begin with. And then we have to kind of strategically, in a collaborative fashion, myself and the client determine what areas do we want to pursue first, right? And then we're kind of breaking those into smaller pieces. Again, focused on the whole idea of getting them quality nutrition, as little processed stuff as possible. And then, if we think of it in terms of 6 months, like ideally, if we're working together for 6 months, at the end of that 6 months, everything that you have developed, throughout the course of that, all of that stuff should be, if we're doing it correctly, all of that stuff you should be able to do indefinitely. And you should have really cracked the code on like why you're doing it, and how to do it, and how to do it really efficiently.
Man, it's a really, really good answer. I love the fact that your foundation is on around a whole foods, minimally processed based diet, because I think, not dissimilar to the United States, you don't have to look too far in an Australian supermarket just to see the ridiculous amount of ingredients that are in the most basic foods. Like, you can see why marketing is such a powerful industry, because to try and sell some of the bullshit foods that we sell with the spin on it that we have, it's mind blowing that we buy into it. And you said that a lot of you touched on the fact that sure, you might still get your macros and things in it. It's amazing how many of the children's cereals that I walk past that'll advertise it's filled with protein, and then it's 25% sugar. You go, okay, well you've taken a specific angle, and this is part of the reason I was so curious to talk to you, because growing up, I was very health conscious. I was maybe a little OCD with it, but ironically, I probably had the worst diet of anyone you knew, because so much of what I was focused on was making sure that the food I was eating as a 90s kid was 99% fat free. And what I didn't realize at the time was, as a result of that 99% fat free, most of the food that I was consuming was really, really high in sugar. And I've got the fillings and, removed teeth to prove it. But as a result, as I started to sort of do a little bit of research myself and just looking into what it is that I was putting into my body, I felt like the foundation of what I've tried to build my sort of health journey upon is whole foods, minimally processed. But that initial process is it's a little daunting because, as I said, every single food that we consume seems to have some kind of preservative in it to give it a little bit longer shelf life. But just as sort of a next jump point, are there certain strategies that you help people with when it comes to choosing foods? Because I don't know if you know Michael Pollan. He's I'm actually not sure what his original title is. I know he's an author, but I think he was a journalist, an American guy. And one of the most helpful things I stumbled upon was a food series that I think he had on Netflix. And he spoke about how if you're trying to clarify what's a good food, think about whether or not your great-great-grandmother would have referred to what you're eating as a food. And the second one was just have a look to see if it's got more than 4 ingredients in it. You probably don't need it. And I thought, okay, there are a couple that I find helpful, and I'm by no means an expert, but I was just curious to know how you guide people with that particular step, because as I said, it can be a little daunting when you've never really looked at it before.
Yeah, it can be really daunting. And I think those, I'm not familiar with him, but I'll seek him out. Those are spot on, right? Like if you think about it, if you go down the meat aisle, you're getting chicken, beef, pork, turkey, whatever. I mean, you're getting meat. If you go, you're getting vegetables, or you're getting spinach, peppers, zucchini, whatever it is, right? You get the point. It's just there. It's raw, and you're gonna cook it or you're gonna prepare it however you want. Carbohydrates seem to be really confusing, on how to pursue those. But at the basic level, we're looking at like rice and quinoa, and I think probably an educational process as well for a lot of folks on what constitutes carbohydrates, what constitutes starchy carbohydrates, what is the purpose there, because it's natural for a lot of folks to think that carbohydrates in general, if anything has carbohydrates, right, it's the enemy, and that's not always the case, right? Where are they? Is it from a bunch of added sugar? Like what kind of carbs are we talking about? But as far as strategies go, there's a million ways to skin the cat. But I think taking those macronutrient groups, the protein, carb, and fat, and just starting there and building out almost a list. Essentially, you're building a grocery list, right? And I think what makes a lot of sense to people, especially when we start breaking these down into those categories and giving them these different options, there becomes more clarity in how to go about this, in how to go about decreasing the processed foods. But I think for a lot of people, it seems to be easier to add in certain things instead of trying to just remove the processed foods. So instead of trying to do an overhaul on everything that you're consuming, we're going to just strip everything out. Again, that's not sustainable. That's a drastic change. If you're not eating any vegetables, maybe we keep your diet how it is, and we just try and add in, 1 serving of vegetables at lunch, for the week or for 2 weeks or whatever the case may be. So kind of identifying what's the biggest area for growth or for improvement, and potentially attacking it that way. And that makes sense to some people, right? I just have to add things to it. And eventually you're adding so many pieces in that the things that you want to remove are naturally, they're kind of naturally going to remove themselves. Does that kind of make sense on, an overall approach? Like the other piece that's going to play a role into that is like, what are they doing? What's their exercise look like, right? Because if they're coming to you for weight loss and they're completely sedentary, they're not doing anything, then that's something else that we're looking at just trying to get some kind of movement, and to start that process in a progressive nature as well. But there's more probably runway with that in that situation, because we're not trying to fuel performance necessarily. Obviously, that's going to be a conversation at some point, but different from somebody maybe that's competing or running, or training for a race and logging a lot of miles and doing different types of workouts. Well, if their nutrition's not on point, then we're kind of zeroing in on the performance and the energy and the recovery piece and the foods that can help them get there. I think a great starting point is just like, what is your goal? Because the nutrition is facilitating, all of these changes in nutrition are facilitating some sort of end state that you hope to pursue. Nobody's coming in saying, I want to improve my nutrition just because I just want to improve my nutrition, right? There's it's related to some other goal, whether it be aesthetics or body composition or, weight loss, performance or so.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I like the idea of meeting a person where they're at in their particular journey and just alternating the sort of approach that you take to improving their diet based on what it is they're trying to achieve. But one of the things I'm curious about, and I've had a few different people on the show to chat about this, and I'm always just interested to hear the thoughts, because every time I leave a podcast with someone with a particular approach, I'm always convinced that approach is right. And the thing I'm interested in at the moment is, as a kid growing up in the distance running world, it was always about carb loading. Everything was just about carbs, carbs, carbs. You want to run fast, get more carbs, which seemed for so many athletes to work just beautifully. Like from a performance perspective, you go, okay, well, I can't really argue with it, because there was a lot of great performances, a lot of fast marathons run off that. And then I don't know if it's just because I've become more curious or there's been a real move in the scene, but there seems to be a real focus on a ketogenic diet or like a fats-based energy deriving system for runners these days. Yeah. And if I spend long enough listening to either side, as I said, I become convinced that particular side is true. But the thing I struggle with is there's so many incredible results on both sides of the spectrum. Like some people saying fats only, some people saying carbs only. That I go, okay, well, you're both a lot faster than me, and you also seem to know more about what you're talking about than me. So now I don't really trust my own judgment. I was curious to see if you had a perspective or any thoughts on that from a performance perspective. Do you have any particular platform or foundation that you preach from, for lack of a better term?
No, that's a good question. So I've seen some of those documentaries, and I've kind of gone down, in the past, I've gone down the rabbit hole myself of experimenting with different things, right? Whether it's a ketogenic diet or just kind of a higher carbohydrate diet. I would say kind of where I stand for me personally, is that carbohydrates are a necessary source for energy. And I think that can be applied to the vast majority of the population. But there's always outliers, right? So like there are always going to be people that are on a really low carb diet and they're performing at a really high level. And I don't, their body has adapted, right? And they're able to perform really well. When I was doing low carb, and basically was on a ketogenic diet, I felt horrible. Like, as far as performance goes, I think, mentally, like I felt pretty sharp. And that was my original purpose for doing it, was trying to, increase energy and cognitive support and stuff like that. But then whenever I would go to train, I mean, the energy was not there. And I'm by no means an expert on right? Ketogenic diet. But it's, I had troubles with hydration, troubles with cramping. I had a lot of issues that early on for me were kind of just told me, hey, we can continue to try this experiment, but your body feels a lot better when you have, carbohydrates, whether it's before training or whether it's after training for recovery. And that's how I've trained for most of my life. And, growing up running cross country in high school, it was all about carb loading, right? Like even if it was race day, it's not like you're going to gain anything necessarily from the bagels that they have there, 4 hours before the race. But that was just the gist. There's bread and bagels, and all that stuff. And I think that, the tough part is, I would say is maybe the patience involved. So, I'm not necessarily, and with my clients, I'm not trying to convince you one way or the other, but it's important to have that understanding up front that if you want to try something and you want to see how your body feels on it, then you need to create an environment and, some controls in place, right? To actually be able to compare, how things are going and if this is actually working for you. And what I've seen a lot of times is people on a higher fat diet that think that they're like doing keto, but they're not. Their body's actually not in a ketogenic state, and they're taking in, even though they have increased their amount of fat, they're still taking in enough carbs to where it's really hard for them to get in a ketogenic state and start burning fat for energy, or as a primary source of energy. And so that's where it gets really important to okay, we need to, if we're going to do this, we want to track things so that your performance and all these subjective things that we're looking at, whatever the results of those are, we know you were doing a ketogenic diet, or we know you were doing a low carb diet. And probably as it sounds, like that process, even in and of itself, is complex. It's complicated. So in order for somebody to do that, if a client wanted to do that, there are some prerequisites. There's a lot of prerequisites, right, that are going to be in place. Because if you just think of in terms of, if you take somebody that is, seeking nutrition coaching because they, are eating a ton of processed foods, they're not eating vegetables, they're not hydrating appropriately. Before we would even be able to get to the point where somebody's like testing their urine, right, for ketones and, ensuring that a certain percentage of their calories, are coming from fat. Like, how do you take somebody you can't take somebody overnight and that was not really paying attention to their diet and then say, now I want you to have 70% of your caloric intake from fat for every day. And you've got to do it consistently, because if you don't, then you're going to come out of ketosis and then we're going to have this back and forth. So, that can become confusing really quickly and really frustrating for a client, because then you've put them in a position where they don't really have the tools to do this to begin with, but they've read some articles about it and they're interested in it. And I don't want to discount that, because it's totally reasonable and justified, the bringing that up and wanting to discuss about it. But it's kind of important to just paint the whole picture of these are the things that are going to be involved, and to kind of come full circle to your initial question, like, let's get to the point where you have, instead of going to something maybe really complex, let's just take your diet and your nutrition intake to the point where it's just kind of normal. And by normal, I mean really quality. Like, you're having quality carbohydrates. We're controlling your caloric intake. you have good, good habits, good lifestyle habits, like some of these other things. Let's get kind of those up to speed. And then, you can always continue to tweak it and change it. But at least at that point, over time, somebody's going to develop some of the skills that would be required to pursue that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. I like the idea of giving people the education rather than just saying go on this diet, because I'm not sure about you. I reckon I know so many people who have been on a diet for 20 years and are still
Yeah.
well and truly overweight. It's a
Yeah.
stressful thing. Like, not, I think I've got a couple in mind, particularly that have asked me. And as I said, I'm no expert, but I've got a basic appreciation for just whole unprocessed foods. And essentially, when people come to me and say, "Hey, do you have any diet advice?" I go, "Well, not really, but I feel like this makes sense." Like, just if you can eliminate as much of the rubbish that has become called food for extended shelf life, that's a really good place to start. But I think for
Yeah.
me, this idea of the education, I guess, that we've touched on before, about just learning to eliminate those things, but then just making that a lifestyle rather than some little fad, because a fad's, I guess, in the name. It's just impossible to be able to hold on to for any amount of time. It's almost like you're punishing yourself for these good rewards that you're trying to get. It's you've got
Yeah.
this goal of looking better or feeling better or whatever, but the way that you're going to get through is through depriving yourself and abusing yourself, and living off salary for 6 weeks and just counting
Right.
down the days that you can finish off until you can just reward yourself with a massive block of chocolate. It's just
Yeah.
it's a very strange scene, and it blows my mind how I don't know, just how out of touch so many of us are. And to be fair, as I said, I was for a long time, but one of the big factors that got me back in line was I read The Blue Zones by Dan Buettner. I don't know if
Okay.
you ever I don't know if you ever read that, but just for
I
those
haven't.
listening,
Yeah.
no, it looks at the oldest, healthiest so-called population groups around the world. And there's 7 different areas they call the blue zones. One's in like Sardinia. There's one in Loma Linda, California. It's like a Seventh-day Adventist group. And
Okay.
I think it's the word of the moment is epidemiology. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
Epidemiology.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
so they're trying to determine what factors make these people so old and so healthy, and I think they measure it by the quality of life amongst the centurions in that particular population area.
Yeah.
And one of the things that stood out on all groups is, apart from sort of faith and friendship groups and regular exercise routines, is exactly what you're saying. Is you look at their diet, and the Seventh Day Adventist group in Loma Linda, for example, it's essentially what you've just promoted. It's this idea, or encouraged. It's this idea
Yeah.
of, like, all right, I think for their particular faith perspective, it's like, all right, is this how God created it? And if the answer is yes, it's like, all right, I'm pretty sure we can consume that. And I'm not sure whether this was coincidental or whether this was true for all of the areas, but another standout feature was, like, they had a very high vegetable intake, relatively high fruit intake, and relatively low in comparison to most Western countries' meat intake. And I know there's a lot of different opinions
Yeah.
on what that means, and how much of a health factor that meat was.
Sure.
Um, but I find it hard to look past that from a longevity perspective. Go, all right, well, what's worked? And then you see that and you go, okay, well, it's hard to move away from something like that.
Yeah. I totally agree. I think so. When you say what's worked, right? Like that's I think that's a powerful question, and that's something that I talk about with clients. We call them bright spots, right? So if you're maybe you're a brand new client, maybe you're somebody that I've been working with for a while, but when you reach that obstacle, or if you're just trying to get a baseline assessment, right? Like when you were exercising regularly, you know what was going well, like how were you able to do that when you were eating a more nutritionally dense diet? What facilitated that? How were you able to do that? Point being, a lot of these answers are out there, maybe in our previous experiences, and we just don't, myself included, sometimes, right? Like we don't always take note of them at the time, and then maybe 2 or 3 years down the road, you're in a similar situation, and you kind of have a playbook. And I think so. I think that's a great place to start is like what went well, or what group of people are doing this really well? Like, what are they doing? Um, and, and you can kind of emulate that. And, and it seems like that's a great starting point for any obstacle than trying to recreate the wheel and come up with your own solution. Um, that's a good place to start. And I think it also comes into the whole idea of just like drilling down on this outcome, which everybody has some kind of outcome. They're seeking something, and a lot of times it's with especially with weight loss or with a performance goal, like you want to bench press so much weight, or you want to run so fast for this upcoming marathon. Like it takes takes behaviors to create that. Like it doesn't happen by itself. The outcome doesn't just present itself. And so I think in the context of yo-yo dieting, for 20 years and stuff like that, it's natural to get really hyper focused on the amount of weight that you want to lose. And you kind of put the behaviors, right, that are required to create that outcome to the side, because you're just trying to jump into a protocol, and trying to make that protocol happen and work. And then when it either doesn't work or it becomes too much of a burden, then you're kind of back at that starting point. And so I talk a lot about, behaviors leading to outcomes. So if we can think of all of the behaviors that would be required to PR your next marathon, or to, bench press, whatever it is, or to lose weight, like what are the foundational behaviors that are going to be required? And if you can create, or make those habitual, right, where you're just kind of in autopilot, you're no longer having to consciously think about it necessarily. Whatever that outcome is that you're seeking is going to naturally happen, and it's going to be sustainable. You're going to be able to continue that indefinitely because you've gone on a deeper level, right? Yeah. So.
Yeah, it's a really good point. What are some of the foundational factors that you work through when you're trying to develop the habit in an athlete, whether they're doing the bench press or the marathon? What are there some sort of universal principles that apply to everyone in whatever field it is that they're trying to improve?
Yeah, so I think you can look at, like, if you're taking performance, well, if you're taking really any goal, right, you're looking at nutrition, you're looking at, and within nutrition, you're looking at, quality, consistency, portions. You're looking at, in terms of exercise or movement, we're looking at, how often are we moving, and then how well are we moving, and a whole lot of other things can fall into those categories. But think of movement quality, and then movement consistency at the base. Looking at sleep and recovery. So obviously that plays an enormous role in whether you're losing weight or you're going to perform. You have to recover, and you have to prioritize recovery. And part of that is through sleep, but part of that's through, taking care of your body, and, active recovery days, off days, high low days, like making sure that you're not going 100%, every day, in training. It doesn't work. Our bodies break down, and then you have this, these diminishing returns. So you've got sleep and recovery. Mindset is a huge piece too. And specifically with mindset, kind of developing this growth mindset. And, I think a lot of times we have, our mindset shifts depending on the subject matter, right? Or, so you can maybe have a growth mindset, about work or something, meaning that you kind of look at everything, right, as a growth opportunity, and you seek out, feedback from your peers or superiors or whatever. you know, opposite of like a fixed mindset where it's like this, I can't lose weight. I'm just not meant to lose weight. I can't run faster. I'm just not meant to, break the record or hit this time. I never ate vegetables as a kid. I'm just not supposed to eat vegetables, like that type of stuff. So, totally natural. And we all have it in some way, shape or form, probably in multiple aspects of our life, this kind of balance back and forth. And it's a continuum really. So it's not all fixed or growth. But that's a huge part of the process too. And I think that mindset can set you up for success for some of the other pieces, like the nutrition piece and the exercise piece, right? Because if you're more open to kind of pursuing the process, which is naturally going to be filled with, adversity at some points, like that's inevitable, but a lot of victories too, and a lot of personal growth and development. I think creating that mindset shift can do a lot in all of these other areas. Stress management is another big one, and we could say stress management or emotional regulation, but kind of in a lot of ways, almost getting out of our own way, and being being compassionate with ourselves, like self-compassion is a big piece of that, and can kind of arm somebody with maybe a better ability to recognize when they're not succeeding, but instead of beating themselves up over not being 100% successful, right? Noticing the growth that has happened, even if it's just a little bit. So kind of all of those different categories, right, are related in some way, shape, or form. And ideally we want to look at all of them, regardless of if the person is just focused on performance, or just focused on weight loss, because the whole idea, right, is like, regardless of what the goal is, if you're just focused on one aspect of those different categories, if the other ones are falling apart, it's eventually going to impact whatever you're doing for your specific goal, right?
Yeah, I really like your point about I never really thought about growth mindset being something that fluctuates from scene to scene. Like look at a person and quite often people say to me, "Oh, you're so optimistic." And I'm like, I guess like my overall approach to a lot of areas of life is very optimistic, but there's certainly some areas of my life where like impatience, I think, is something that I really like. It's just been, I think it's going to be a lifelong thing that I got to keep working on. And growth mindset, I think too often, and this is probably an area of growth mindset I could develop, is you've either got it or you don't. But the truth is, it's like, yeah, you're right. Like I know that in a lot of areas, I'll spend time with my kids. I'm like, man, I'm nailing this. Like I'm such a good dad today. Right. But then I'll catch myself being impatient again, and it'll be like, Tice, like you're still working on this. Like, why do you suck at this so much? It's that's a helpful little principle to remember, isn't it? That you haven't always got it or you don't. I've been watching Ted Lasso, that TV show on Apple TV, man. And me and my wife said to me last night, she's like, "Why can't I just permanently have a Ted Lasso attitude?" And I was like, "I wouldn't." I think I'm not sure. We're only up to the end of the first season. I'm not sure if he explodes and like takes a gun out to a field at any stage, but he seems as though it could be a couple of things bottled up there. But it's right. Like he's got he definitely seems very, very positive. But for me, just that's a little gleaning from this conversation. For me, just that understanding that you're not going to be 100% in every area, and especially from a running perspective. And for those listening, especially when I was running at a higher level, I often struggled if I had a couple of bad races in a row. I would find it very easy just to go, okay, well, I guess I'm just not quite in good form. And I wouldn't mean that I would stop training. It wouldn't mean anything else. But just that little psychological shift would take place, and lining up on another start line to try and have a good race. It seemed like an impossible task. And
Yeah.
like, are there any little strategies? Because this is an area I'm fascinated by as well. That you work with people to develop coming back from disappointing results, because this is something that I think every runner has to, or every person, but for this instance, every runner has to navigate at some point in their career.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of my favorite strategies is just is noticing. It's called noticing and naming, right? So noticing the emotion or the thought that's going through your head, um, and putting a label on it, essentially. So, kind of once you do that, it seems to just give more context, right? Or more understanding. So, if um, you're really bummed out about training, or you don't want to train quite like you used to after a bad race, or you're getting really nervous for an upcoming race. Like, I think we try and push that stuff out of our head. Like, we try and not think about it. Um, and I would encourage you to do the opposite. Like, think about it, and, embrace it, and name the emotion, and kind of, you know, explore why you're feeling that way. And you're trying to normalize it, right? Um, but I think that, you know, that's a powerful strategy. I think, identifying the bright spots, to go back to the beginning. When we're talking about bright spots, you know, trying to identify, if we're talking about racing, trying to identify previous moments of adversity, in racing, and whether it be, preparing for a race, recovering from an injury, uh, a race that you crushed, like, trying to find all these different scenarios, and pick out, like, well, how did these things happen? Um, how was I able to bounce back from the last injury, or the last, um, uh, race that I didn't feel as good about?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I've made spreadsheets on this with clients, like, because when you pull all this information out and you put it on paper and you're staring at it, um, you can't avoid it. And you come to realize, like, okay, these are some strategies, or these are some ways that I've been able to overcome this in the past. Um, and maybe you give yourself a little bit more credit than you did initially, because I think the opposite effect is, like, the negative self-talk, and that can be really destructive as well. To go in the opposite direction. Um, but I think those two pieces right there, and those are things that you can do. You can do in, a couple minutes, right? Even if you just feel something creeping up, like, in the way you feel, just you kind of take a moment to pause and think about it, reflect on it, and label it, um, and then you've at least kind of acknowledged it, and you maybe have a better understanding of why you're feeling like that. Because once you understand why you're feeling like that, then you're likely in a better position to determine what you're going to do about it, or how you're going to, react to it.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I like the I'm not sure what it's called officially. It's the way I heard it explained. It's like crushing ants, crushing the automatic negative thoughts.
Yeah.
And one of the ways to do that was so situation will take place, and then a negative thought will kick in, and then for so often, if I'm not focused on it, or if I'm busy, I've just had as I mentioned to you before I hit record, we've recently just had our second kid, and I'm not sure if you've got kids, but our house at the moment, it's just thanks, brother. Our house at the moment, it's just it's amazing, it's full of energy, but there's not a whole heap of time just to kick back and relax. And as a result, I notice when I'm so flat out, they're the moments that I'll just get trapped in a particular thought and won't take the time to sit down with a notebook and pen and try and challenge those automatic negative thoughts. And for me, just having like a double column, like what you said, labeling it, writing down, well, in my instance, writing down whatever the thought is, and then on the other column, challenging it, coming up with like a more powerful, positive alternative, like an equally possible reality, but just from the other side of your brain or whatever. And it's amazing how often when I sit down for 10 minutes and go, all right, Tice, what's bothering you? And you write it down. And then you go, okay, well, is there another way to interpret this? And you're like, as a matter of fact, there's 7. And just writing those, I always leave going, oh, wow, I'm such a happier person.
100. That's awesome. And because it's amazing how the brain works, right? Like we naturally jump to what's going bad or like what's distracting. And sometimes it's just, we're not taking enough time to even think about it. Journaling is something I don't do. I am getting into it. So I've done it a couple times. I need to create a systematic, to do it regularly at a specific time or whatever. But one thing I have started doing recently is just doing like a little after action at the end of the week. So just writing down what went well this week, like, because I'm sure you're super busy. Like the good stuff can kind of, you can kind of be like, okay, this went well, on to the next thing. Right. And you forget about it. And all you're focused on is just the stuff that has to get done or the stuff that's not going great or whatever.
It's a really good point. It's amazing just how much a little shift in perspective can help just make you a happier person, huh?
Yeah. Oh, totally. It drives everything.
Yeah.
It drives everything for sure. I think it's so interesting to talk about this too, because it sheds light on it, and hopefully people that are listening to this or watching it, like they take it to heart too, because I think it sounds kind of like, for somebody maybe that comes in for performance, right? Like maybe mindset is appealing, maybe it's not. And for a lot of people, I think it's like, what are we talking about mindset for? You know what I mean? Like it sounds just like frou-frou, or nobody wants to talk about it. It's like this is powerful stuff. So yeah, I think I'm glad you brought it up.
That's really true, man. It's I honestly know. Well, I know for a fact that each of these subjects, like it's a whole couple of hours podcast in itself. But I know you've got other things to do with the rest of your life, so I'm not going to keep firing questions away. Looks like it might be evening over there. You're probably getting what time is it in Atlanta right now?
It's just about 6 o'clock.
Oh, okay, so almost dinner time. So I won't hold you up any longer. But for everyone listening, obviously, you said you're working with people. You don't have to be elite. It might just be people making small lifestyle changes, trying to get the ball rolling. Where's the best place to find you? And with the love of the internet and just living virtually at the moment, obviously, it doesn't matter where you are in the world if you want to work with you, I'm assuming.
Yeah, that's correct. So they can find me on Instagram at Coach Ben Reale, and the website is c1fn.com. And yeah, it's all with remote coaching, and then with the health and fitness coach or health and wellness coaching. Both those are basically virtual online pieces. So regardless of location, you can reach out, and we can have calls like this, and we can make things happen without. And that's one of the amazing things of now almost post COVID, because for so many of us, this online world like blew up, and all of a sudden the possibilities of being able to reach out and work with more people in different locations. So hit me up on either of those, and That's the best place to find me.
Yeah, awesome, man. Well, thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, you bet, Tyson. Thanks a lot, man. I appreciate it.